we're going to have four really good political reporters, people that I have a lot of confidence in and that I've really enjoyed knowing over the years in my public policy and political life. And they're going to join us so that we can talk a little bit about what happened yesterday. For those of y'all that don't know what happened yesterday, you're watching the wrong webinar. You're meant to be on something else. No, we're going to talk about the election that happened yesterday and what we can anticipate in November. So let me tell you who we've got. First, we have Taylor Goldenstein. She is the state bureau reporter with the Houston Chronicle. She covers politics. She's actually with the Hearst newspaper's Austin bureau, where she reports for both the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. She was a visiting fellow at the Nieman Foundation in 2014, the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. She's previously reported at the Austin American-Statesman, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and Tampa Bay Times. She's joined by Gromer Jeffers. He's a graduate of Howard University and he's a native of Chicago. He came to the Dallas Morning News as a City Hall reporter, where he covered the administrations of 4 different mayors since 1999. As a morning news political reporter, he's written about national and local politics, including presidential campaigns, since 2000. He writes extensively on Texas government politics, and you can catch him on Lone Star Politics. We're also joined by Jonathan Tylove. He's the chief political writer for the Austin American-Statesman, where he also writes a blog called First Reading and a weekly Sunday column. He's been a reporter for 43 years, working as a political reporter and Washington correspondent for a variety of newspapers. And he's the author of a 2003 book, Along Martin Luther King, Travels on Black America's Main Street. And last but not least, we just went in alphabetical order, is Alexia Ura, who is an associate editor and demographics reporter at the Texas Tribune. She covers the intersection between politics and race with an emphasis on our state's surging Hispanic population. She also covers voting rights issues for the Tribune, where she started as a reporting fellow in 2013, and she's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. So we're going to start, but I want to remind everybody that if you have questions, you want to chat on something, feel free to go to the chat part of the icon there at the bottom of your page, and please give us your questions, and we'll try to cover those as we go through. So with that, let's start. Yesterday was a big election day. It was an odd election day in the sense that it fell on a time that we normally don't expect to have elections. July 14th is not one that those of us that are political junkies normally think of. And it's in the midst of a pandemic that is surging and all of the debate and discussion that goes along with that. So, but we still had it. It was still held and they counted the votes. What I'd like to ask as we start this off is, were there any election results that any of you found the most surprising to you? Maybe not crazy surprising, but at least surprising. And why would that be the case? And Taylor, why don't we start this the way I introduced everybody? Taylor, why don't you start?
Most surprising. I think you should come back to me. I need to think about it.
Well, Gromer, tell us about what you think.
Well, I don't know if I found one individual result surprising. What I found surprising was you just mentioned that it was an election in July amid a pandemic. I guess what was surprising to me is it felt like, in terms of the participation and the interest, a normal election. I mean, remember in 2012 when Ted Cruz and Dewhurst faced off, I think that was July 31st, but it was in the dead of summer, and a lot of the voters were in the mountains or in Colorado somewhere or skiing, and that kind of felt like a dead of summer primary. But this time there were a lot of voters. I think had nearly 1 million. It felt like people were engaged, and it's a signal of what could happen in November. I'm expecting a big turnout in November. So it was surprising to me that originally we thought that a pandemic election would be sort of a snoozer, kind of boring, kind of not a lot of people interested in it, but it was kind of the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. Tyler, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess what struck me was the Senate runoff between MJ Hager and Royce West. And it wasn't that the result surprised me. What surprised me was that the result was kind of confirmed what people like Romer and others and I had been reporting, which was that the George Floyd killing really changed the dynamic of that race, and that totally under-resourced Royce West managed to make a very competitive race out of it. He didn't win, but I thought it was kind of thrilling to see that people were paying sufficient attention to that election, that it wasn't something that was simply based on who had more money or who was considered the front runner. And I found, yeah, as Gromer said, it was kind of exciting that there was a real live election under these conditions, and that it was a consequential one and a really competitive one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both the margin and the total votes in that race, thinking of it as sort of the top of the ballot statewide race on the Democratic ballot, it was much higher than I think we were anticipating for a runoff just in general, more so when in a pandemic, more so when voters who maybe registered for the first time this year were trying to figure out how to participate in an election safely, whether that was also voting by mail for the first time or not. And so I think that the total number in that race was really surprising. Obviously, the Democrats have taken some positive cues from the turnout that they are seeing. I think also left unspoken is the number of votes that weren't counted that could have been part of sort of that total figure in that race as voters were still trying to navigate how to be able to participate in the election during the pandemic.
Taylor, you want to add anything to that?
No, I would agree. I would agree.
Yeah. Well, that causes me to want to ask all of you, particularly as you talked about it and what it means, is, one of the things that here we are in a pandemic, everything is disrupted and feels different, and including, for example, having the conventions and the way we've done the conventions. So let me ask you a little bit about that. John, you wrote about the virtual Texas Democratic Convention quite a bit, and one of the people watching us says that she even talked to you about it. Talk a little bit about what's happened with the Republican convention and whether, under this set of circumstances, how difficult is that going to be for them to pull that off when they go from we're going to do it in person to virtual?
Well, even as I kind of agree that having an in-person convention in Houston under these circumstances would have been insane, and I would have been there, which would have made me part of the insanity. The virtual conventions, they suck. They're just they're not interesting, they're not fun. Part of what you get at a convention is a sense of the organism of a political party, who these people are, what they look like, what they sound like, how they react to one another. You don't get any of that in a virtual convention. A virtual convention is a series of canned speeches, and it's a struggle to stay awake, even if it's well done. And I think the Republican Party takes its conventions more seriously than the Democrats, because they really want to work out their position on, processing milk or whatever the issue. I mean, everything under the sun they want to contend with, and this is their life. And I think Democrats, it's more just kind of, it's just something you do because it's good to see everybody and you got to get some business done. So I was completely empathetic with the Republicans who were fighting tooth and nail to have a convention that, is really a thoroughly bad idea. But I'm trying to think about how to cover what's going to happen in the next few days virtually. And it just doesn't carry the same interest or the same potential as a live convention.
Yeah, yeah. Alexa, you wrote, I guess, today, it was in the Tribune today, about the practicalities of yesterday and just how the day went. Why don't you comment a little bit on that, and kind of set in the context, and then we'll get into some of the specific election results.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did not see any of the sort of election day and night drama, for lack of a better term, that we've seen before, right? There weren't voters waiting 5 to 7 hours to cast their ballots in Harris County. There weren't, widespread problems of technical failures of voting machines or anything like that. But I think what we did learn from this election, with yesterday serving as obviously the end point to it, is that there are a lot of issues that need to be resolved ahead of, kind of this big show in November. We saw polling closures. We saw polling place closures in some counties where poll workers were unwilling to work the election because voters weren't going to be required to wear masks, or because they realized they didn't ultimately feel safe in that environment because cases have been getting worse every day. And that's going to be a huge problem in November when these counties are actually running more polling sites than they ran for the runoff. Mm-hmm. I think the other big issue that this highlighted is that there is this sort of information gap around the alternatives that voters have to voting in person, whether that's mail-in voting, whether that's curbside voting. There are some existing barriers, right? I talked to a blind voter, for example, normally votes in person, uses an accessible machine, no problem. This time around, she was trying to not vote in person and realized that the mail-in ballot application was not labeled for someone with a visual impairment to be able to go through. She realized that she needed to sign her ballot, and if not, get a witness to sign it for her. And she is a single mom with 2 kids, and so that would require her breaking quarantine to be able to do that. There are all these sort of very specific instances of the barriers that voters are facing. And then on top of that, there are the barriers that are created when there's not sufficient and clear information about how to be able to go through this process. Even someone who doesn't have maybe a visual impairment but has no idea how this works. I spent a lot of time with voters sending them applications to vote by mail because they had literally no idea where to even find that. And so I think going into November, when we know turnout is going to be much, much, much higher than it was in this runoff, those are some of the main issues that need to be addressed, both by local election officials, but also sort of state election officials who ultimately oversee the election infrastructure that, needs some work before an election this big in a pandemic.
Yeah, and that actually causes me to want to ask Taylor or Gromer, either one of you, was the relative lack of problem that, and I use the term relative for a reason, there was a relative lack of a problem in the voting, and this is one of the questions that we're getting from some of the folks in the chat room. Was that due to the fact that, as Alexa points out, there were much less voters, the ballots were a lot smaller, you weren't having to deal with no longer having straight ticket voting, or is that we're doing better with our voting infrastructure? Is it getting up to speed?
I think it's what you said, and a lot fewer voters, right? It's not a November general election. It's not even a March primary. You didn't have the long lines that you saw in March, right? In where you are in Houston, at various places in Houston, there were long lines, people trying to vote. You didn't have that sort of situation, so you sort of caught a break with all of that, and not too many. Some counties only had 1 or 2 races on the ballot to contend with, so this was an easier process for them to manage. November could be a historic turnout here in Texas. We're talking about like 2008 levels when you had Obama mania. People are ready to vote, I can tell you. So if they have the COVID-19 under control, at least to the point where you have people voting in person more, then we'll have a true test of our election systems. And I'm with Alexa. I don't know if they're up to it yet. We'll see.
Taylor, you cover and spend a lot of time, I think, on the House races and the more local races in the Houston area. and we were talking before when everybody was in the waiting room and we were getting ready to come out, it seemed like it was harder to get results harder to get results last night than we're used to. You updated Secretary of State's page, but it was still difficult. And then trying to get those local results. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it set a lot of people back, the Secretary of State's site glitching. And then, of course, some counties are slower than others, and, we've got districts that stretch across counties. So it was a lot of, napkin math you're doing, just trying to add up, all the different counties.
I worried a couple of times that I was actually doing fractions, and that's just not good news for me to be.
That was scary, Taylor, I gotta tell you, do math like that.
Yeah. Well, I would say too, with not having issues, I think the longer early voting period too, took off a lot of the stress on election day, just that 2-week period. And we saw so much higher turnout during early voting than we ever had.
That's a good point.
And some of the other, let me just point out quickly, some of the county officials were sort of allowing people to vote by mail without asking a whole lot of questions. And I think that helped out as well. You didn't have to prove you were ill or sick or anything like that to get a mail-in ballot in many places.
Well, you actually don't have to anywhere for the most part. And so I think that what we saw in this sort of fight between the Democrats and civil rights organizations and Republicans over expanding mail-in ballot was some real confusion among people who would normally qualify without a question about whether they still did. And so there was some work that locals had to do to sort of clear the record on that. And just to build on what Taylor said about the longer early voting period, obviously the governor has indicated we'll probably be seeing that for November as well. We don't know, does that mean 3 weeks of early voting? Does that mean 4 weeks of early voting? We still don't know that. But I think we also have to keep in mind that an early voting period requires more resources, right? You need to find polling places that will let you stay for a lot longer than you normally would. And this is the first general election in which Texas will no longer allow counties to have sort of pop-up polling locations that are sort of 3 days here and 3 days there, or 3 days on a university and three days at another university. Every single polling location needs to be open for the entirety of early voting this go around. And I think we're going to see some challenges as locals try to figure out where they can safely host voters, where they can keep machines 6 feet apart, what locations will let them stay for a longer early voting period when they normally use places like grocery stores and schools that may be out of the question. And so I think it seems like we are without a doubt going to have a longer early voting period for November, but I think that will also bring some serious questions and challenges for local officials trying to make this work.
Excellent.
The downside of early voting is that you miss late-breaking developments in a campaign. So let's say in the presidential, what if President Trump displays some kind of erratic behavior closer to the election? Will people not have the benefit of that knowledge?
We saw that in March too, Jonathan, when folks dropped out of the race before the Texas primary, and they were still on the ballot here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that there's an alternative. It's just that it changes. October surprises have to come like in September, really.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Oh my goodness. Oh,
You're back.
I'm back. I'm sorry. Gromer, it wasn't your answer.
I interrupted you.
I'd be wondering there, Kurt.
I thought you left me off.
There have been a lot of people in the state of Texas and beyond that have tried to figure out ways that they can just freeze me in time, but and get and not have to listen to me. Anyway, so with that being, I appreciate that. I don't know. I'm sure it was a great answer that I'm probably going to wish I hadn't missed when I was frozen out for a second. Let's talk about the election, the specifics of some of the elections, and obviously the one that was kind of top of mind and top of ballot was the runoff in the Texas, the U.S. Senate Democratic primary between M.J. Hagar and Royce West, and the results are in, and MJ Hagar won that with a little over 52% of the vote, and Senator West had right at 48% of the vote. Let me ask if there was anything that surprised anybody about that. Grummer, I know you've done a lot of coverage of that. Why don't you start, kick us off?
Well, it was closer than it would have been before the George Floyd killing, as Jonathan pointed out. It was closer, I think, than it would have been then. What Royce West, who you work with, Senator, was able to cast himself as the person for the moment. And let me just give him credit. He worked his ass off. He worked hard with little to no resources. But at the end of the day, that's why Hagar had an advantage. She was backed by the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. She raised money on her own. Emily's List came through with her. And so she was able to reach out to a cross section of Texas voters. Royce West wasn't able to. Just look at the Rio Grande Valley, counties in the valley that Hagar won. You would think that West could have been more competitive there, and he wasn't. And it just sort of made the difference when you have commercials running in the days before the campaign, and your rival does not. That gives you an advantage. So I think West can be proud of making this a race, but at the end of the day, it would have been really difficult for him to overcome the money advantage. Also, suburban women voters, watch out for them. I mean, Hagar connected with those voters. One of the fastest growing segments of the Democratic Party base now is these suburban voters, and voters that used to vote Republican. Disaffected Republican voters she was able to connect with. That's a good sign for her in November.
Taylor, what do you see in the race, and what do you think about the results that we got?
In the Senate race?
Yes.
I was saying kind of the same thing. I mean, obviously, when you come in with the DSCC behind you, I mean, that's a powerhouse. And so I think, like Grummer said, she came in with a big advantage. But the fact that definitely a little bit surprising, and it got close for a minute there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Jonathan, anything you want to add about that?
Well, if you look at the map of Texas, it's really Royce West really drew out African American voters, and I guess white progressives. The map is that he won around Dallas, he narrowly won Harris County, and then he won East Texas, and the rest of the map belongs to Hagar. So I think the question for her is, for Democrats to be competitive, they really need to tap into what he tapped into in terms of Black voters, because it's, that's what Obama was able to do, and that made all the difference. And it's not enough to win a 70 or 80 or even 90% of the vote. You need to get every last one of those voters out there. And I don't think she has a natural connection. I think for her and for all the Democrats, the saving grace is that Donald Trump is on the ballot, and that 95% of the outcome in the Senate race will be what happens in the presidential race.
Alexa, you got anything you want to add to that?
I would just say that I think what will be interesting in this one is, there are a lot of Democrats who are going to vote Democrat no matter what. There are Democrats who may not be energized enough to vote in every single one of these races now that we no longer have straight ticket voting. And so someone like MJ Hagar will not get the benefit of the, non-regular voters who turn out to vote in a presidential election, not really knowing who their representatives are at lower levels of elected office. And so I think that's what will be interesting to watch in this race, because at the end of the day, the electorate for a runoff is probably a much more informed and maybe engaged electorate. It's more regular voters who more regularly hear from campaigns, who know that they are likely to vote. And so I think the big question here is, how does this go over? How does the Hagar-Cornyn matchup go over differently than a West and Cornyn matchup in a general election with a pretty different electorate than you get during a runoff election?
Well, along those lines, let me ask a question about that, because and we've talked a little bit about it, but straight ticket voting. You know, a lot of us are used to straight ticket voting, and Alexa, as you point out, a lot of people go in, and that's what their plan is. And if you don't know down ballot, there's an association that allows that. Talk briefly about what impact that will have on a U.S. Senate race, and with no straight ticket voting, utilizing what the four of y'all have been talking about, that you think shows the map.
Yeah, I mean, I think going into November, when you were going to have, you know, what we can all agree is probably crazy turnout not just compared to the runoff, but to even previous general elections. There are many voters, some first-time voters, some regular voters, who might have wanted to vote straight ticket, because if you're living in Harris County or Dallas County, that's a pretty long ballot that you are dealing with in a general election in a presidential year. That option will no longer be available. It's a huge X factor into this election. Obviously, it's not an option that all voters use, but particularly when you think about the down ballot enthusiasm, or how much a voter is going to be how long a voter will be willing to stay at that booth, going race by race, after possibly waiting in a line to be able to vote, while also maybe trying to get in and out as quickly as possible, because we'll probably still be in a pandemic by then. And I think that there was already an X factor going into November around the elimination of straight ticket voting, and it is now creating even more confusion and more sort of questions around voting behavior in a pandemic, when, by the way, we'll also have some of the municipal elections that were delayed from May tacked on to the bottom of the ballot. And you know, will be interesting to see how many voters in some of these big places even get down there.
Yeah, and let me just point out that Hagar and Cornyn will benefit, because they're still at the top of the ballot. They're right after the president. So that'll help, except for folks who are just going in there to vote for or against Trump. And what Jonathan said about Hagar is right. I mean, we will be, in 2018, we would have called Beto O'Rourke Senator O'Rourke had he pumped up his African-American support a little bit more. He lost by 2.6 percentage points, and he really didn't have the outreach he needed in the African-American community, in the Black community. Hagar will need to work on that. I agree with Jonathan, 100% there.
Yeah. Anybody want to add something on that? Because now I'm going to ask you, what are your expectations? We've kind of created a context and talked about this, but let's talk about what your expectations. I know what the pundits are saying. I know what the current polls have. You know, some of the polls, like the CBS News YouGov poll, has Cornyn 44, Hagar 36, which is a +8. I mean, he's up in all but one poll that was done with Morning News, but that was kind of an old one, near as I can tell. Cornyn's up in those, but what are y'all's expectations? And let me ask it two ways. What are your expectations, and what are the issues that are going to drive this U.S. Senate race? Taylor?
I mean, I think it wouldn't surprise me if it came close. I think Texas is moving in that direction, and we see, you know, from how much enthusiasm there was in this, you know, runoff, which is usually pretty low turnout. I mean, not to say that it was all from the Senate race, but a large part of it was probably due to that race. So, I mean, I could see it being, you know, something for the nation to watch.
Yeah. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think this entirely depends on what's happening nationally, because Hagar starts with next to nothing in terms of resources. Cornyn's got a lot, but Cornyn is at this point entirely tied to Trump. Yeah. And Trump's things are not looking good right now, and there's every possibility they're going to look a lot worse in a couple of months. The question is, are the national Democrats going to focus on Texas? And Biden put out an ad the other day for Texas. I don't know if they will go all in or not, but I think that's what makes this promising for Democrats, because I think there is a chance they will make a significant investment here, and that she'll be able to, if not catch up, have the kind of resources she needs to be competitive. And I think really it's all going to be Trump fallout. If anybody can turn Texas blue, it's going to be this Trump presidency. And I just think we're in for what may be a historic turnaround in Texas. I don't know that that will happen, but I think the potential for that to happen. And that's how you end up with people in the Senate and the House who you didn't expect to be there. And that could include Hagar.
Yeah. Gromer, you had mentioned suburban women. And one of our listeners, one of the people watching, indicated that corresponded with the informal polling that I guess he had been doing. But how does that play out in this now that you have, we now have the Democratic nominee? I know you said to watch out for it, but what about that split that you see in some households between how the couples are voting?
Right.
You know,
that is interesting. Trump is a key factor in all of this because he is sort of driving suburban voters to the Democratic column in a lot of respects. But let me give you a reason why something may be going on here. You saw John Cornyn getting involved in the Democratic runoff like no candidate before, right? I mean, running the ads to try to, I mean, they were veiled attack ads against West, but they were designed to draw, to excite the Black vote in Harris County. He has Sheila Jackson Lee in there. They're worried that Hagar can galvanize suburban voters, particularly women and others, and form that coalition that would make it difficult for Cornyn because she will tap into votes that he normally would be able to rely on. And keep this in mind, Cornyn has, in 2002, he ran against Ron Kirk, different time, different election. He was on the 2008 ballot, you know, Texas was still kind of red, really red. And then 2014, probably at the apex, the height of Republican dominance when Abbott beat Wendy Davis by 20 percentage points. This is his first real test here. And I think they're worried that solid Republican coalition that they've been able to rely on is sort of cracking. And that's what you have to look out for in November.
Yeah, and I think the Cornyn's problem is he does not make the Republican grassroots heart beat faster.
Right.
If there were a real convention, you go around and ask about Cornyn, and there'd either be a shrug or a dismissive look.
Remember
he has never had that kind of grassroots support. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they used to boo him, Jonathan. Remember that?
Yeah.
At the conventions.
Yeah, I mean, every 6 years there was who's going to challenge him, you know, from the Tea Party wing. They never did, and they might not have defeated him. But the point is that unlike Cruz, who for all his polarizing, also polarized in his favor, Cornyn's there's just a tepid reaction to him.
Yeah.
Alexa, would that explain part of the reason that an incumbent United States senator that's been there as long as he's been there has been in leadership positions in the United States Senate, high leadership positions, would only be polling in the mid to low 40s right now? And is that some reason for them to be concerned?
I mean, I think you can't take this race out of the moment we're in, right? There are people who are losing their health insurance and dealing with medical issues they haven't had to before. There are people who are out of jobs and are trying to sort of bear the burden of that. There are people who are, you know, kind of, there's revived activism around racial injustice, and more people sort of in that umbrella of people that for whom that might be a deciding factor when they are casting their ballot or deciding how much to get involved in an election. And I think as we go into November, whether you're talking about, you know, white suburban women, whether you're talking about young first-time voters who are more likely to be Hispanic in a state like Texas, given the age differentials in the electorate, you know, the deciding factor for people to cast a ballot has always been something that we look at, right? We always poll and say, what are the main issues that are important to you now? And I think what we're seeing right now is that some of the issues that have always been important to people, like healthcare, are now more widespread as more people are affected by the pandemic or are affected by the stances that they see their potential elected official taking on some of these issues. And so, the motivating factor for voters will be interesting to watch here going into November, looking at where Cornyn's approval rating is now, because you just can't take this race out of this broader moment that we're in.
And that's why, Kurt, I believe that Cornyn and down ballot Republicans need President Trump to sort of, there's still time. I mean, this is an eternity in politics, but he has to rehabilitate himself in terms of the pandemic and other issues and tighten it somewhat before November. Because if it continues going in the direction it's going in, I mean, that could be a nightmare.
Yeah.
For down ballot Republicans across the country, not just in Texas. But there's still time for him to sort of rebound somewhat.
So well, let's go a little bit down the ballot. Let's talk about the U.S. congressional races, U.S. House races. We had quite a few yesterday, runoff type elections that'll make a difference in what we see in November. I'm just going to mention a couple of them, and then I'm going to ask you all just to comment on the ones you want to comment on. But Congressional District 10, which is a district that involves Austin and Travis County and runs basically all the way down to the Houston area. Mike Siegel won that runoff election, so there's going to be a rematch between Mike Siegel and Mike McCall. In the last 2 years ago, in 2018, Siegel got 46.85% and came within just 4 points of Congressman McCall, who was only at 51.1. Then in Congressional District 17, that's of interest because Pete Sessions, who had been a member of Congress and in leadership from the Dallas area, lost last time to Colin Allred up in the Dallas area. But he basically moved to Central Texas. He moved to the Waco Bryan College Station area, and he won that runoff. So that's to replace the incumbent Bill Flores, and he'll face the Democrat Rick Kennedy. Pete Olson's seat, where in Congressional District 22, that was an interesting one in that Troy Nell won with 70.3% of the vote against Kathleen Wall. And Kathleen Wall last cycle spent over $6 million to not make the runoff, and then has spent somewhere between $7.5 to $8 million this time to not make it to the general election, which a lot of money for that. But anyway, so now Troy Nell will face Kulkarni, who has run before, and that'll be an interesting general election. And then the last one I'll mention, and there Grover may want to mention Congressional District 24 too, because there was a runoff in the Democratic primary there. But it's Congressional District 23, which is that mammoth district that runs all through West Texas, San Antonio, all the way over to El Paso area that Will Hurd is retiring from. That is a district that just over and over and over again is always close. And in the primary runoff, the Republican primary runoff last night, Tony Gonzalez and Raul Reyes came within, last numbers I had, 7 votes of each other. So that's too close to call. Nobody knows who actually won that. Going to prove what your mama always told you, every vote counts. But those are just some of the congressional races, and there may be others that y'all want to visit about. But let me start. Taylor, do you want to talk about any of those?
Yeah, I can talk about 22. I mean, that was a blowout. We saw we had Fort Bend Sheriff Troy Nell's taking 70% of the vote over Kathleen Wall's 30. And like you mentioned, Kathleen Wall, more than $8 million into self-funding her own campaign. We saw some of her TV ads come out trying to cast Nell's as maybe not doing enough in the way of combating human trafficking, and it just ended up not being enough with Nell's kind of having that name recognition and familiarity as the sheriff for so long. It just, even with all that spending, it didn't seem to make a dent.
Yeah.
And my colleague, actually, Jeremy Wallace, was looking at the history of self-funders. He found that 9 out of 10 have lost their races, the only one being Van Taylor in 2018.
So spending your own money doesn't always, even if you got a lot of it, doesn't mean you're going to win.
No.
Other ones that y'all want to comment on?
I think in 10, Siegel.
10 is the one that will be the rematch of Siegel and McCall.
Right. And, you know, McCall's already on the attack. I guess he's done careful research and has determined that Siegel is the most radical liberal running for Congress in the entire United States. I'm not sure if he put a lot of money into that research, but in any case, I think what's changed for Siegel is every day new people move into that district, and more than not, they're Democrats. And the other piece of it, I guess, is back to Trump. I just think that Siegel was lifted by Beto last time, and that if he's going to win that, it's going to have to be on the strength of Biden winning that district. I don't see too many Trump Siegel voters out there, so I think that that's another one where he's a hard worker and he'll do everything he can, but it's an unwieldy district that's hard to get to. All of it, either by media or in person. And so I think that that's really going to be the question of whether there's a kind of really strong Biden performance, even if he doesn't win the state in a district like 10.
And I'll just mention 24 for
and for folks that don't know, that is the retiring Congressman Kenny Marchant is retiring from that district.
Right, and it's nestled in between Dallas and Fort Worth there. And Candace Valenzuela won the runoff against Kim Olson, the retired Air Force colonel. That surprised some people, but it's a good sign for Democrats who are waiting for a strong Latina, in her case, candidate to take advantage of that growing demographic in that district. So there's a lot of excitement about her candidacy. She'll be running against the former Irving mayor, Beth Van Dyne. And again, like Jonathan said, this will be sort of another Donald Trump kind of thing. Does he help or hurt the Republican candidate there? And it will test the changing demographics that we're seeing all across the state. A lot of people moving into North Texas from other places.
Alexa, go ahead.
I just wanted to build on what Gromer said, because I do think that race will be really interesting to watch, both because of the demographic change, because of the candidates that in a lot of ways, you know, maybe it's oversimplistic to kind of use them as proxies for the voters in that district, but it sort of said, you know, you have the person who could be the first Afro-Latina in Congress against a former mayor who obviously probably will have the support of the president in this race. And, you know, I just think it's an interesting thing when you think about these districts that were drawn, you know, nearly 10 years ago to be under Republican control. And after 10 years of growth and demographic change, particularly in North Texas, where you are seeing huge increases in the Hispanic community in particular, this will be an interesting race to watch. I don't think it's going to be a bellwether district or anything like that, but it will be very interesting to watch, particularly if it does happen to flip right ahead of redistricting. That could, you know, be a big gain for Democrats as they're trying to sort out this map and now have an incumbent whose voters will probably look a little bit different than the voters who would have supported a Republican candidate, and can build a district around those voters.
Let me just build on what Alexa just said about redistricting and how things change in a decade. In 2008, Democrats came within 2 seats of taking over the Texas House. A lot of people don't remember that. And then you had the 2010 Tea Party elections. I mean, where Democrats were pushing that rock up the hill, they almost got it up there and then got wiped out in 2010. This election is just as important because Dems are 9 seats away from taking the House, all these important congressional races. And we'll see what kind of state this is now. Because if the demographics change the voting patterns, then you can see going into the next decade big changes.
Yeah, and I think if you think about those sort of sweep elections and think about 2010 in particular, we have seen this play out before, right? We had the Corpus Christi seat that flipped to Republican, to Farenthold, you know, in a pretty surprise, fluke win, I think, by a lot of standards. It happened right before redistricting. And so Republicans were able to redraw what had long been a Hispanic opportunity district into one that doesn't resemble it whatsoever. And, you know, obviously it was litigated in court for many years as lawyers argued that Hispanic voters in that district no longer had the same, their votes no longer counted in the same way. You know, we have seen this play out often to, according to the courts, the detriment of voters of color. And I think this district up in North Texas could be one that could fall under sort of a similar category depending on how it goes.
And Kirk mentioned Pete Sessions. That's not a district that's a target for Democrats, but I was recalling yesterday that when Pete Sessions, who had been defeated in the Dallas district, decided to try to come back in this district, which is between College Station and Waco, I got Bill Flores, the incumbent Republican, on the phone, and he said, "Okay, are you taping this? Good, please do." He spoke very slowly for an hour about how awful he thought what Pete Sessions was doing was, and just how he would then read me quotes from local Republicans about how offended they were by Pete Sessions bigfooting his way into their community. So it's not a given, but it's not a race that I think Democrats are really contemplating making a move toward.
Yeah, and you make a good point, and a nice segue, because what I focused on obviously were some of the races from yesterday, but let's look forward to November, because as you point out, that's an interesting race because of what Sessions did, but it's probably not going to be one that everybody's paying attention to the day after Election Day in November. What are some of the other congressional races that y'all will be watching with interest because of what the differences it might make, or because they've got a lot of appeal to them? And I think, by the way,
the district that MJ Hager almost won, and probably would be the favorite in if she had run again, the 31st district, which is Wilco and part of Bell County, has been totally off the radar, and I don't think Democrats are really seriously contemplating, but it is certainly within range. And Donna Imam, who won yesterday, is this kind of totally self-reliant candidate who is a little hard to pin down. She doesn't want to tell you, like, when she was born, how old she is, because she thinks it'll somehow prejudice you. She didn't want to come to a Statesman editorial because she doesn't want to be with the other candidates, but she won decisively in that district. And she had Andrew Yang's support. So I don't underestimate her, and I don't underestimate the power of the demographics in that district, which has been trending purple and even blue.
Yeah. Others? What about the one we've had a question about, the 21st Congressional District, which is the one that Chip Roy won against Joseph Kopser last time, but now Wendy Davis is the Democratic nominee.
Right, that'll be the MSNBC Fox congressional race of the year, because they're both totally polarizing figures. They both have strong, supporters and detractors. Wendy Davis is a fundraising powerhouse, and Chip Roy has managed to kind of outdo Cruz in distinguishing himself as being a little bit outside the political mainstream. So I don't know. She still has to persuade people in the Hill Country in enough numbers, but she will drive up, turnout in Travis County to the max.
I'm also watching to see if Colin Allred up here in Dallas, he's defending against Genevieve Collins, and if Lizzie Fletcher in Houston, can they cement the seats that they won in 2018? Can they build on that and keep it in the Democratic column? And also pay attention to District 3 in Collin County, the seat Dan Taylor has. National Democrats probably won't put a lot of money into it, but Collin County, Beto O'Rourke won 46% of Collin County. There are 2 House seats in Collin County, one held by Leach, the other by Shaheen, that are in play. Let's see what Lulu Cycli, who won the runoff yesterday, how close she can come to beating Van Taylor. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. And
Rachel Bidicopper, who's this forecaster was very close on the 2018 congressional results, says that Taylor's district will flip strictly based on the number of highly educated people in that district, which she says is the key barometer of disaffection from Trump, and that there are numerous districts in Texas, including Van Taylor's, that are right.
If I'm right, Jonathan, that's the best educated district held by a Republican or not, something like that.
Right. And it's that's who she said Trump has driven out of the party.
So we'll see.
So two quick things, because this has been a great discussion and exactly what I was hoping would happen, but I want to cover two things before we go. And we, by the way, for those that have been putting up questions, I've been trying to put your questions as part of my questions to the panel as we've gone along. But the first one is, what happens to the Texas House in November? What do you all think about the Texas House, particularly now that we have the primaries and the runoffs behind us and we know who the players are going to be? And then I'm going to have a bonus round question. So, Grummer, why don't you start and briefly tell us what you think happens in the Texas House?
Well, we'll see.
You pointed out there's only 9 seats.
9 seats. And we'll see what happens. But I tell you what, the seats in Collin County, I mentioned Shaheen Leach, plus 2 Dallas County seats, Angie Chin Button and Morgan Meyer. Those are Republicans that are really should be concerned that they could lose. But look to Tarrant County. Democrats are making a push in Tarrant County. Some of those seats out there, Stickland, Tenderholt, some of the Fort Worth seats. If they can get several seats there, it may make it easier to pick up the 9. But in 2018, it was low-hanging fruit. This will be a little bit tougher.
Taylor, talk a little bit about what you're watching there in the Houston area.
I would say the same. I mean, I think we're seeing, kind of this reprisal, but, with a little bit more knowledge behind it. I mean, now Democrats know kind of more about what's at stake, and so we're going to see bigger pushes.
Great. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very close. I think the advantage to the Democrats is that flipping the House is of such huge consequence that may be the tipping point in terms of Democratic commitment to Texas, because if there is any chance of getting a hand in redistricting, you're talking about changing the map, not just for Texas, but the congressional map in terms of control of Congress. So I think that becomes a decisive factor for national Democrats in how much commitment and money to pour into Texas.
Alexa, you got anything you want to add to that?
I would just say that I think one of the things to watch for is what happens in the suburbs. I know Grummer has pointed to this a bit, but we have seen a decline in Republicans, stronghold in these Republican strongholds over time. Some of them are a little bit more ahead of others, but that decline has, we've seen it go down. We've seen them lose that stronghold a little bit quicker in the Trump era. And I think as we're going into this election, that will be interesting to watch because of both what it means for congressional seats, for what it means for some of these possible pickup seats that could lead to the flipping of the House, and then ultimately what that performance means for redistricting when we go and set the districts for the next feasibly 10 years, unless there's a mid-decade redistricting again.
And Kurt, before you get to your last question, if I'm a Republican donor or a Democratic Party donor, I pump money into those down ballot House races because of what Alexa just said. It is so important because it's going to set the course for the next decade. And a lot of people, it's sexy to give to the presidential candidates or the Senate candidates, but people should be investing in those down ballot races because that's what will determine the course of politics in the next generation.
And it's going to be very interesting. I wish we had more time. Maybe we should all do one on redistricting, one of these on redistricting at a later point, because the fact that there haven't been the kind of hearings you normally have during an interim,
right?
We've expected to have a bunch of hearings all over the state already on that. the fact that the census numbers are going to be coming in so late, whether there's manipulation of the processes is also going to play a big role. So we may need to have another one just on this at some point. So we're almost out of time. It is the hobby hour, not the hobby hour plus. So I'm going to try to do my first one at least on time. But here's what I want to ask you. We've talked a lot about the role that the presidential is going to play in these elections we've been talking about. So I've got a two-part question. One is, to use Gromer's phrase, will Trump rehabilitate himself or rehabilitate himself in some way? And where do you see Texas going in a Biden-Trump race? And Gromer, since you gave me the rehab word, I'm going to go with you first.
Well, this Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 9 points, right? Right now, the structural advantage that Republicans have statewide, he's still the favorite to win Texas. The question is, how much, if he does win it, does he win it by? Is it 5 or more? Is it less than 5? And of course, if he loses, it's a complete disaster, for everybody, for every Republican in the country, because there's not only no path to the White House, but he'll bring all kinds of Republicans down with him. But, we'll just have to see what his margin will be. Taylor,
what do you add to that?
Like Alexa brought up earlier, I think the pandemic is going to have a huge role. Obviously, his legacy right now, leans on him, handling this in the right way. And as far as it's looking right now, especially in Texas, the numbers are not looking good. So I think a lot of, his approval rating going down is related to, people not being satisfied with that handling of the pandemic.
Yeah. Jonathan?
There is not a shred of evidence from anything Trump's done to now that you could possibly change. His best hope is that the pandemic will magically disappear as he's predicted. I think it's going to be very, very close, and it's residual Republican identity against the facts on the ground.
Alexa?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's not much indication that we'll see a change in terms of rhetoric, in terms of policy. And I agree with Taylor that the way this pandemic plays out, particularly as early voting starts in that general, could make a big difference to where that margin could be different than it was in 2016.
Well, great. Let me tell all four of you how much I appreciate your serving as the inaugural guinea pigs in the hobby hour. Thank you very much.
Kirk, I just have one thing before we leave.
Sure.
Considering that I assume you consider yourself close and good friends and allies with Sarah Eckhart and Eddie Rodriguez, you've got a nice job now, but how do you sleep at night?
Oh, yeah. You raise a good point. For those that don't know, there was a special election yesterday to replace me in the Texas Senate, and there will be a runoff. The County Judge Sarah Eckhart will lead in that runoff, and she got 49.7% of the vote. That's how close it was. So if you're wondering why he's giving me grief, there it is. Well, thank you all. Thank everybody who's watching us and listening. On the 19th of August, we will have the next at noon, the hobby hour. I will be hosting County Judge Lena Hidalgo and Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner. I hope you will register and join in. I've noticed that our panelists are drinking out of hobby school cups.
There you go.
Since I'm living in two different places a lot because of the pandemic, I apparently left my hobby school cups in my other place, so I've masked my coffee cup. So here's to the four of y'all for being a part of the inaugural. Thanks for helping me christen it. Everybody out there that's watching, please stay safe, happy, and healthy. Thank you God bless everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.